This book should have been the perfect book for me. A dark, poetic retelling of one of the most fascinating goddesses in Greek mythology. And for the most part, I did enjoy the book, but there was a constant feeling at the back of my mind that made me think that something wasn't quite right. Because when you already have a connection with a deity, you spend years learning about them, learning their mythology, and also working with them, you start noticing the little details. And in this case, these details felt less like a creative interpretation and more like a complete reshape of who Hekate actually is. And this is what I want to talk about today. Hello, my gorgeous viewers and readers. Welcome back, or welcome if you're new. I hope your weekend was filled with magic, with potions, and maybe the quiet feeling that you're standing at a crossroads in your life. Because today we're talking about Hekate the Witch by Nikita Gill. This was a book that grabbed my attention immediately the moment I saw it for quite the strange reasons, if I am honest. So I will be very vulnerable right now. And this is not something that I have mentioned in this channel before or that I mentioned in real life either. But I think this is relevant to this book and to this video. And it's the fact that I have been a follower of Hekate for multiple years now. We're talking since my teenage years, so more than 10 years, right? But yeah, I have been a follower of her for quite a while. And for those who don't know, Hekate is typically known as the goddess of boundaries, of crossroads, of witchcraft, necromancy, all of that, right? She is the one goddess in Greek mythology that I really resonate with. So when I saw a modern retelling centered around her, I immediately bought it. I was so excited. And I started the book thinking I was going to love it. And even though in some ways I did, in some others, I struggled way more than I expected. Just as a quick summary, this book presents an incredibly poetic retelling on Hecate's story, where we see her as a central figure while she navigates things like power, transformation, and identity through the Hellenic world. We follow her journey through all the different realms in the Hellenic world. So obviously the underworld, the Mount Olympus, but also the mortal realm. And throughout this journey, we meet different characters, obviously all of them within the Hellenic world, like Hermes, Hades, or Persephone, and all these characters that are either related to the underworld or to the Olympians. The narrative of the story heavily leans into themes like power, exile, war, survival, vengeance, but most importantly, in reclaiming one's power. In this story, Hekate is portrayed as someone who is shaped by conflict, loss, grief, and vengeance. And also, she is considered someone who has to carve out a space in the world for her. And also, if we look at the book specifically, we see that this story is much more poetic than it is narrative, which makes the story much more fluid, right? And also, it makes these stories sound much more human and much more emotional than it could ever be if this story was actually narrative. Before I get into the nitty-gritty of the video, I want to make something very clear. First of all, I am not an expert in ancient Greek mythology. Obviously, everything that I have learned has come from all the intense study that I have been doing during the years. But also, I am very aware and I acknowledge that Greek mythology doesn't exist in a vacuum and it's not something fixed, right? It heavily depends on culture, on traditions, and all the different versions that exist in this world. Now, all the things that I will be talking from now on come from my own knowledge, from my own perspective, and all the things that I have learned and picked up ever since I started practicing, and all the knowledge that I have been carefully growing for the past 10 years. Now, I don't want to talk about the book without talking about the main star of the story first, which is Hekate. She is one of the most interesting and fascinating deities within ancient Greek mythology. And even though she is not very well known nowadays, apparently, according to research, she was extremely popular in ancient Greece, more specifically in East Greece and also Turkey. So within that sort of side of the world. But yeah, for those who don't know, she is often described as the goddess of magic, of witchcraft, potions, but also the goddess of boundaries, of crossroads, of liminal spaces, everything that is regarding the space between the two worlds. And this is what makes her particularly interesting, because when we look into ancient Greek mythology, we see that there are three very distinct realms, right? So we have the underworld or the Hades, we have the Olympus or the Mount Olympus, and then we have the mortal realm. But then when we look into all the deities that exist within the pantheon, we see how very clearly as well, we see how all the deities are differentiated by realms, right? So there are certain deities that live in certain realms. So, for example, we have Thanatos or we have Hades that live in the underworld. And then we have Zeus or Hera or Artemis who live either in the Olympus or that hang around the mortal realms. But they don't really go into the underworld. There are not that many deities that actually can go from all the or to all the realms separately. One of them is Hermes, but then Hecate is also one of the only characters who can actually traverse worlds. And what is even more interesting is that Hecate is actually one of the only deities who actually has power in all the other realms. So obviously we know that Hades is the king of the underworld, that Zeus is the king of the Olympus, so therefore the god king, or then we have Poseidon, who is the king of the sea, right, or the king of the ocean. Actually, if we look into the research, we see that Hecate is mentioned as the queen or the person or the deity that has power over all three realms, over earth, sky, and sea, which makes her really, really powerful as a deity. And in fact, we see in many stories how all the gods actually deeply respect her and even revere her, right? She has a special relationship with Zeus. He actually deeply respects her, and she's actually one of the only goddesses that has not had any sort of relationship with Zeus, or that Zeus has never tried anything with her, which says a lot about Zeus, but also says a lot about Hecate, right? So we see her as an incredibly powerful figure. In practice, her worship is extremely varied. It depends on traditions and cultures, and it just depends on the person as well. So the things that I have seen most commonly practiced are usually night rituals, usually offerings during the dark or new moon, as it's called as well. I have also seen people asking her for guidance or for protection against ghosts or any sort of haunted stuff. But most importantly, what I see everyone doing, and that is the main thing that attracts people to Hecate, is usually protection and guidance through any sort of crossroads or pathways that you have in your life. So practitioners don't really see her as just a dark goddess. She is a protector. She is a guide. She is someone who has your back, and that nuance matters in this book. Now, I want to start with the things that I did like about this book, because there are incredibly strong elements about this story that I genuinely enjoyed. For example, the first one is the prose. I thought it was beautiful, and I thought the way it made, like the way the prose was created, it made the story much more fluid, much more engaging, but also much more atmospheric. I felt as if I was there with Hecate, or as if I was Hecate, right? Obviously, I am not. Please take that into account. But yeah, I felt as if I was there in this story, and I felt as if I related to her. So I think that was something that I heavily enjoyed. Another thing that I really loved about this book was the way some characters were depicted. So figures like Hades, Hermes, and Styx were given the emotional complexity to actually become both the victims and participants of large systems of power. So when we look into modern retellings, one thing that I always see, and this is what I think is the biggest flaw of many modern retellings, is that they romanticize these deities. They add them, or they put them as hero figures or either villains as well, right? But we don't see this dichotomy very often, which I think makes this book much more complex. And speaking of world building, one of the things that I loved was the expansion of the underworld. It was so incredibly created, but also so carefully crafted that made the story much more interesting. And it also made the journey much more complex, and it added some profundity to the story and the transitions that Hekate was going through. Honestly, 10 out of 10. I absolutely loved it. And the last detail that I really appreciated about this book was the way Hecate was presented as a triple goddess, because this is something that we see in later traditions, but also that adds richness to the character. Obviously, showing the transitions, showing the crossroads, but also showing the liminality of her as a deity. So honestly, chef's kiss, that was amazing, and that added so much to the story. Because this is why I'm so conflicted. This story is very clearly imaginative. It's creative. It's also written with purpose and with care, right? But this is where things get complicated, because obviously it is a modern retelling, so we naturally assume that there's going to be some creative interpretation, and I do not blame Nikita to do that. That is sort of expected, but there are details about Hecate as a deity and as a figure that do not make sense in this story whatsoever. The first thing I want to comment on is Hecate's family relationships. So when we read the book, we see that there is a lot of emphasis put into Hecate's relationship with her parents. So with Asteria, and then with her father Perseus, more specifically with her father. But when we look into original resources or into original sources, we don't see any mention of her relationship with her parents. In fact, if we look into all the original sources, we see how Perseus is barely mentioned ever. So he is considered more as a genealogical source rather than an actual deity or an actual figure, right? With Asteria, we have certain myths that are really important and really interesting and fascinating to look at, more specifically her relationship with Zeus. But for Perseus, we see absolutely nothing, or at least as far as I know. There is no sort of evidence regarding Hecate's relationship with her parents whatsoever, at least as far as I know. So I don't really understand why we had to add this part of her relationship with her parents into this story. Obviously, I understand that it makes sense plot-wise, but I don't understand what this story tells us about Hecate as a deity or as a figure. So in this sense, the fact that we added this part, to me it looks less like an expansion of the character and more like a total invention that shifts the focus of her story. Now, the one thing that genuinely made me upset was her romantic arc with Thanatos. I was genuinely so upset about it. To me, the decision to give Hecate a relationship, particularly with Thanatos, was a bad decision, just straight up. Because if we look into her lore, if we look into her traditions, we see that Hecate is mainly a maiden goddess. She has no partners, she has no relationship, and she has no children, apart from one specific myth that says that she is the mother of Scylla. But apart from that specific myth, the rest of her lore, the rest of her stories say that she is a maiden goddess. But here is the kick though, because maiden doesn't just mean unmarried. It means that you are removing yourself from all potential relationships. This is exactly what happens with Artemis, with Athena, and also happens with Hecate. They are the three maiden goddesses. They are untouchable. Not even gods, not even Zeus himself can touch these three goddesses. Hecate is not characterized through her relationships or through her romance. She actually exists on her own. She exists as her own particular single individualistic figure. So it makes no sense for you to give her a relationship because she is not meant to be described as someone's girlfriend or someone's wife or someone's mother. She is herself and she is her own person. So in this sense, introducing a romantic storyline within Hecate's lore, the only thing that you're doing here is decentering what is important from her character. So instead of actually looking at Hecate as someone who is claiming her independence or someone who is claiming her own power and someone who is just going through the crossroads and just knowing and having the confidence that they know or that she knows where to go, what you're doing with this romantic storyline is creating a character who is seeking emotional validation, seeking romantic sense and romantic deep emotions, but also that is seeking this desire to be loved. Another thing that I did not enjoy about this book is the relationship that Hecate has with Olympus or with the Olympians. Because if we look into traditional sources, we see how Hecate is not marginalized. She is actually revered and she is actually heavily respected, not only by Hades or everyone else around the underworld, but also from the Olympians themselves, right? We see how Demeter is actually asks Hecate for help, which obviously we see in the book, but then Zeus actually deeply respects her and actually considers her one of the most important figures within the pantheon. And in fact, it has been argued amongst experts within ancient Greek mythology that Hecate should be considered part of the pantheon, like all the six big gods and also all their children, right? She should be in there as well, not as a minor goddess, but actually as a main goddess. And if we look into tradition or like Greek traditions within the ancient Greek mythology, we see that Hecate was deeply respected amongst humans as well. She was not just some unknown figure. We see how people actually revered Hecate on a daily basis. She was part of the household. Like, I just don't understand how we consider her just someone who is marginalized when in fact she was deeply important within the lore. To me, she is one of the most powerful figures that we see within ancient Greek mythology. So the fact that she is introduced and that she is portrayed as a minor goddess or someone who is marginalized or considered unimportant and then slowly gains her own power and her own independence, but also still has some sort of romantic desire and desire to feel loved, it shapes the character and it shapes her lore into something that feels extremely familiar. So when you look at what works and what doesn't for this book, I see something that I recognize. I see how this story takes a very complex, powerful, well-established goddess and then suddenly turns it into something that is more recognizable for us in the modern world, which is the misunderstood woman, the wounded figure, and the one who suffers but then suddenly rises. And while this narrative is very compelling, especially within the literary world, I also think it is incredibly common in modern retellings of Greek mythology. In fact, I will go as far as to say that this is getting way too common. You guys are getting a little bit too comfortable in getting ancient deities and just turn them into what you want. But yeah, that is my opinion. Obviously, I'm a little bit of a hater, but I think there are too many books that have this sort of rhetoric. We need to switch it up. So to me, this story is less about the deity herself and more about fitting her into the structures and systems that we already know. And this is why the disconnect happens, because Hecate doesn't need to find her power. She already has it. At the end of the day, this book is an incredibly engaging and beautifully written retelling. If you are looking for something dark, atmospheric, and incredibly creative, you must read this book. This is absolutely worth reading. Now, if you are looking into this book from a deity perspective or from someone who is deeply interested into Hekate, maybe this book will not give you what you're expecting. And I think that is okay, because at the end of the day, we can have creative differences, and we also need to allow writers to have the freedom to write about whatever they want. But also, we need to be aware of the differences or the changes that we're making and how they affect the story of the deity. That's all for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I really hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please make sure that you like the video down below and that you subscribe to my channel. I post here every week, and I have a lot of content that you can watch as well for free. And also, before you go, I would love to ask you guys a question, and is that, have you read Hecate? And if you have, are you a follower, or are you someone who is just interested in Greek mythology? Please let me know in the comments. I would love to know, and I would love to find more like-minded people and more followers, if there are any that watch me and follow me as well. I would love to discuss, and we could create our own little comment. I would love that. But yeah, thank you again for watching this video. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you soon. Bye, guys.